The sun hung low over the dusty hillside of Galilee. Heat radiated from the parched earth, rising in visible shimmers that blurred the horizon. Long amber shadows stretched across the slope, marking the end of a long day of travel. A group of disciples moved together, their boots kicking up fine, tan grit that settled slowly in the still air. They formed a tight, uneven circle on the flattened grass. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant bleat of a stray goat and the soft, rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath their feet. They watched Jesus. He stood a few paces apart, his back to them, finishing a time of quiet prayer. The air felt heavy, charged with a sudden, localized stillness that made the surrounding landscape seem to hold its breath. Every movement among the group was deliberate, cautious. They shifted their weight, bracing against the cooling wind, eyes fixed on the figure before them. The anticipation was palpable. They had seen him work, seen him heal, but in this quiet hour, the air demanded something more. The disciples closed the gap slightly, narrowing the circle, their faces turned toward him in silent, collective focus. The moment hung suspended, waiting for the first word to break the quiet. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Nobody moved. The collective focus of the group was a physical weight, pressing against the space between them and their teacher. One man shifted his feet, the sound of dry grass snapping like a gunshot in the quiet. He looked at his companions, seeking an anchor, but found only mirrored uncertainty in their gazes. He took a half step forward, then hesitated, his heel digging into the loose dirt. His hands were restless, fingers tracing the seam of his pulse, then dropping to his sides. He glanced back at the group, his brow furrowed, lips pressed into a thin, tight line. He was clearly wrestling with the magnitude of what he intended to ask. The others watched him, their own breathing shallow, waiting for him to bridge the gap. He took another step, then another, closing the distance until he stood just outside the reach of the teacher. His shoulders rose and fell with a sharp, ragged breath. He stared at the ground, then slowly lifted his chin, his eyes locking onto the figure ahead, the tension in his frame signaling that the moment of hesitation was finally reaching its breaking point. The man stood still. His chest was tight, the air feeling suddenly thin. He looked at the others behind him, their faces pale in the fading light, then drew a deep, ragged breath that rattled in his throat. He needed to be sure. He needed to know that his words would not be lost in the vastness of the hills. He cleared his dry throat, the sound sharp and intrusive against the evening breeze. He took one final, decisive step, bringing him into the clear space before his teacher. He did not look at his feet this time. He looked directly ahead, his eyes steadying as he finally broke the heavy silence. His voice was low, strained by the weight of his own longing, but clear enough to reach every ear in the circle. "Lord, teach us how to pray," he said. The words fell into the space between them and seemed to anchor there. He did not move back. He waited. The surrounding hillside appeared to lean in, the rustle of the dry grass ceasing entirely as if the earth itself were listening for the response. The question was out, raw and unfiltered, stripping away the pretense of their previous rituals. The air remained still, but the anticipation had shifted. It was no longer a weight of waiting, but a sharp, focused demand for truth. The request hung in the air, vibrating with the intensity of a confession. Jesus did not rush to fill the void. He remained motionless, his posture grounded against the shifting shadows of the hillside. He swept his gaze across the circle, meeting the eyes of each disciple in turn. There was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet, steady acknowledgement of their collective hunger. He saw the tension in their shoulders, the way they gripped their hands. Their bodies braced for a complex set of instructions. They expected a heavy burden of rules, a difficult path of memorized chants and rigorous penance. He let that expectation linger, then slowly shook his head. He did not reach for a scroll or begin a lecture on the ancient laws. He simply exhaled, a sound of release that seemed to brush away the dust of their preconceived notions. The air around them grew lighter, the oppressive weight of religious performance dissolving under his calm focus. He adjusted his stance, his feet shifting slightly on the packed earth to face them more directly. He was ready to offer something entirely different, something that would replace their frantic search for order with a singular, transformative invitation. The disciples leaned forward, their breathing syncopated, as the teacher finally opened his mouth to break the silence. The first two words were not a command, nor a scholarly citation of law. They were a sudden, sharp invitation. "When you pray," Jesus began, his voice carrying clearly across the dry grass, "say, 'Our Father in heaven.'" The effect was immediate. A collective tremor seemed to pass through the circle. The man who had asked the question blinked, the tension in his jaw slackening as the profound simplicity of the address took hold. They had spent their lives reaching toward a distant, untouchable majesty, but these words pulled that majesty down into the very air they breathed. It was an impossible proximity. They stood frozen, the dust of the hillside swirling around their boots, but their focus had narrowed to a single point of light. The vast mystery of the Creator, once guarded by layers of ritual and fear, had been stripped bare and transformed into something intimate and accessible. They were no longer standing before a judge. They were being addressed as children. The air felt charged, different than it had moments before. Each disciple shifted, leaning in as if to catch the echo of the words before they vanished. The silence that followed was not the heavy, expectant quiet of before. It was a stunned, receptive stillness. They were witnessing the dismantling of a wall they had never even realized was standing, and for the first time, they understood that the distance between heaven and earth had just been bridged by a single, familiar title. The word hung there, solid and unyielding, "Our." It was not a solitary cry into the void. It was a bridge. The disciples looked at each other, their eyes darting from face to face. They had spent their lives guarding their own private piety, measuring their standing before the divine in isolation. Now, the weight of that single pronoun forced them into a new alignment. They were not alone. The man beside them, the one whose struggles he had silently observed for years, was suddenly bound to him by the same address. They were children of the same source. The realization rippled through the group. Shoulders dropped. The defensive, rigid postures they had held for so long began to soften. They stood in a tighter circle now, not because they were told to, but because they felt the gravity of their shared identity. The dust of the hillside seemed less abrasive, the vast expanse of the sky less intimidating. They were a family, recognized and invited into a relationship that transcended their small, scattered lives. Every breath they drew felt synchronized, a collective pulse of belonging that turned their individual fears into a unified strength. They looked back at Jesus, no longer as strangers waiting for a miracle, but as a community standing together in the presence of a Father who knew them all by name. Jesus did not pause for long, but the shift in his tone was unmistakable. He had brought them into the room, and now he was showing them where to look. "Hallowed be your name," he said. The words were simple, yet they landed with a weight that stopped the internal chatter of the disciples. Before this, prayer had been a list, a catalog of hungers, a sequence of demands, a desperate reaching for bread and relief. But this new path carved a different direction. It was not a request for provision. It was a surrender of perspective. The disciples stood, hands resting at their sides, their eyes fixed on Jesus as if seeing him for the first time. The focus had been pulled upward. To hallow was to carve out a space that was entirely set apart, a sanctuary where their own small agendas could no longer intrude. The air around them felt thinner, lighter, as if the very act of focusing on the holiness of the Creator was burning away the clutter of their concerns. They felt the shift in their own bodies, the tension of wanting, the anxiety of lacking begin to dissipate. It was an invitation to stand in awe, to recognize the majesty of the source before asking for a single grain of harvest. The atmosphere was no longer about them. It was entirely about the glory that stood before them. The silence on the hillside deepened. It was not the empty silence of a void, but the heavy, expectant quiet of a room where a king has just walked in. Jesus waited. He watched the disciples as they processed the instruction to hallow the name of the Father. One of them, his hands still calloused from the morning's labor, opened his mouth to ask about the day's bread, but he caught himself. The words died on his tongue. He looked at the others, realizing that the old way, the way of frantic petition, had been rendered obsolete by this new perspective. To ask for bread before recognizing the giver was to misplace the very foundation of their existence. Jesus stood still, his presence acting as an anchor. He taught them that glory was not a distant concept, but the very first step of their conversation. Before a single grain of wheat could be requested, before a single debt could be acknowledged, the majesty of God had to be fully recognized. The disciples leaned in, their breathing slow and deliberate. They were learning to reorder their internal world. They were placing the Creator at the center, letting His brilliance reorganize their priorities, ensuring that every subsequent request was filtered through the recognition of His supreme worth. The lesson shifted, moving from the height of heaven to the reality of the earth beneath their feet. Jesus spoke the words clearly. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. He watched the ripple of discomfort cross the faces of the group. Each of them had arrived with their own blueprints for the future, a harvest to manage, a debt to collect, a path to build for themselves. To pray for the kingdom was to invite a different architect to take over. It was an act of profound surrender. One disciple looked down at the dust, his knuckles white as he clenched his hands. Then slowly he unclenched them, letting his palms open to the air. The internal resistance he felt began to fade. Jesus showed them that their own small, selfish plans were like sandcastles against an incoming tide. True peace was not found in the success of their own designs, but in the bowing of those designs to a higher, more perfect purpose. They began to understand that the kingdom was not a place they could build, but a reality they had to inhabit. As the tension in their shoulders eased, the realization settled over the hillside. Letting go of their own control was not a loss, but the only way to finally step into the freedom of the Father's will. Having settled the matter of the kingdom, Jesus brought the conversation down to the dust of their daily struggle. "Give us this day our daily bread," He said. The phrasing was precise. It was not a request for a storehouse, nor a plea for the security of next year's harvest. It was a request for the present. One disciple looked at his own weathered palms, then out across the barren hills of Galilee. The collective anxiety that usually haunted their eyes, the fear of drought, the worry over empty baskets seemed to lose its sharp edge. Jesus was teaching them to stop living in the future, a place that did not yet exist, and to anchor their hope in the reality of the now. He wanted them to see that reliance was a constant, living pulse, not a one-time transaction. The disciples watched the wind move through the dry grass. They began to grasp the lesson. The same hand that sustained the heavens was the hand that provided the bread for the noon meal. By asking for only what was needed for the day, they were cutting the tether of their own restless, future-obsessed minds. They were learning to breathe in the present, finding that the provision of God was not a distant dream, but a recurring, reliable grace that met them exactly where they stood. The atmosphere on the hillside shifted. The calm focus on provision dissolved, replaced by a sudden, sharp stillness. Jesus leaned forward, his gaze hardening, and spoke the words that pierced the center of their collective history. "Forgive us our debts," he said. The air grew heavy. At the mention of debts, the disciples did not look at the sky or the horizon. They looked at each other, then quickly away. The word carried more than coin or grain. It carried the weight of every broken promise, every silent betrayal, and every grudge they had nurtured for years. One disciple shifted his weight, his jaw tightening until the muscle pulsed. Another gripped his forearm, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the dirt, as if trying to bury the memories rising to the surface. The comfort of the previous lesson evaporated. This was not a request for bread. This was an interrogation of the soul. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was jagged. Jesus watched them, reading the flinch of their shoulders and the way they avoided his eyes, the reality of their own failures. Long kept in the shadows of their minds, was now laid bare in the light of the afternoon sun. The tension was absolute. They stood trapped in the sudden, suffocating recognition of what they were owed, and what they owed in return. Jesus did not let the silence linger in their shame. He completed the sentence, his voice steady and cutting through the tension. "As we also have forgiven our debtors." He stood and stepped into the center of the circle, forcing the disciples to look up. His eyes moved from man to man, demanding an accounting. He was not merely speaking of a legal transaction, he was forging a link that could not be broken. He pointed to the fields below, then back at them. The logic was inescapable. They could not reach upward for mercy while holding their fists clenched against their brothers. A disciple, known for his quick temper, opened his mouth to protest, then stopped, his throat working silently. The connection was clear, raw, and deeply uncomfortable. To withhold grace from another was to sever the very pipeline they depended on for their own spiritual survival. Jesus waited, letting the weight of this condition settle into the dust. He watched them process the realization that their relationship with the divine was inextricably tethered to their mercy toward those they found hardest to love. The air was no longer heavy with just regret. It was now electrified with the demand for immediate, active reconciliation. The realization hit them not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, chilling shadow. If the gate to heaven was opened only by the key of forgiveness, then their own clenched fists were locking them out. A disciple gripped the edge of his tunic, his fingers trembling. He had spent years nursing a grudge against a neighbor, convinced he was justified in his coldness. Now, that justification felt like lead in his chest. Jesus remained still, watching the internal collapse. He did not need to speak. The truth was doing the work. The disciples looked at the ground, then at their own hands, realizing those hands were empty of mercy. One man let out a sharp, ragged breath, his shoulders finally dropping as the mask of his own righteousness slipped. The bitterness he had protected like a treasure was now exposed as a barrier, a wall of his own making that kept the divine light from reaching his spirit. The silence was absolute. They stood on that hillside, stripped of their excuses, staring into the void of their own hearts. They were beginning to see that every drop of mercy they demanded from God was being dammed up by the resentment they refused to release. The air felt thin, stripped of the comfort they had sought, leaving only the raw, burning truth of their own need for change. Jesus did not pause for their recovery. He moved to the final, piercing truth, and lead us not into temptation. The words hung in the heat, stripping away the last of their pride. They had spent their lives building defenses, certain of their own moral stamina. Yet Jesus was now demanding they admit they were incapable of holding their ground alone. A disciple shifted, his heels digging into the dry earth, a visible tremor moving through his frame. He wanted to claim he was strong enough to resist the pull of the shadows, but he could not meet the gaze of the man standing before him. Jesus stepped closer, his presence forcing them to confront the fragility of their own hearts. It was a brutal, necessary unmasking. They were not warriors in control of their own destinies. They were children, prone to wandering and easily lost. The realization drained the remaining tension from their posture. One by one, they slumped, their heads bowing, the weight of their self-reliance finally crumbling. They were admitting, for the first time, that the world was too vast and their own resolve too thin. They had no armor against the darkness they chose to invite. By asking for guidance, they were effectively surrendering the illusion that they could navigate the path by their own wisdom. The hillside was no longer a place of teaching, but a place of total, quiet surrender. The final petition, "Deliver us from evil," was not a request for comfort. It was a cry for rescue. The shadows they had ignored for years now felt tangible, pressing inward against the edges of the clearing. A disciple reached out, his hand grasping at the empty air as if he could physically hold back the darkness that threatened his peace. He tried to stand taller, to tighten his grip on his own integrity, but his muscles failed him. The effort left him breathless and swaying. He looked at the others. They were all searching for a foothold, finding none. The darkness was not just an external force, it was a gravity within, pulling them toward patterns they could not break. Jesus stood firm, a singular point of unwavering light against the encroaching gloom. He did not ask them to fight the darkness with their own strength. He asked them to lean. As they watched him, the desperate tension in their shoulders began to dissipate. They were choosing to let go of the struggle to save themselves. The air around them grew still, almost heavy, as they stopped resisting and started depending. They were no longer trying to outrun the shadows. They were positioning themselves behind the only barrier that held. The realization took root. They were not meant to be their own saviors. They were meant to be held. The silence on the hillside stretched, heavy and profound. Jesus looked at them, his expression devoid of the rigid formality they were accustomed to in the temple courts. He dismantled their understanding of devotion with a single gaze. He spoke of the hypocrites who stood on street corners, their voices rising in rhythmic, hollow chants meant only for the ears of men. They treated prayer like a performance, a set of empty sounds repeated to gain status. Jesus shook his head, the movement subtle but final. He rejected the notion that God was a spectator to be impressed by volume or duration. A disciple winced, remembering the long, rehearsed liturgies he had performed for years. He had thought that complexity equaled piety. Jesus reached out, his hand open, palm upward. He was not calling for a new set of rules or a more intricate formula. He was calling for the end of the show. He demanded a direct line to the Creator, stripped of the posturing and the vanity that had clogged their worship. The disciples looked at one another, the realization dawning that their previous efforts were merely noise. They had been acting out a scene, but now they were invited into a conversation. The performative mask was falling away, leaving only the raw, exposed truth of their own hearts facing the divine. The air felt thinner, cleaner, as if the suffocating weight of centuries of tradition had finally evaporated. A disciple took a long, steady breath, his chest rising as he stopped trying to measure his worth by his words. There were no more steps to follow, no secret phrases to unlock the divine presence. Jesus had cleared the path entirely. He stood before them, a bridge made of flesh and truth, connecting the finite to the infinite. The disciples watched, their hands unclenching at their sides, the tension of performance replaced by the stillness of reception. They felt a sudden, sharp clarity. God was not an object to be appeased by correct articulation. He was an audience of one, waiting for the honesty of a child. One man looked down at his own calloused palms, then back at Jesus, his eyes bright with the shock of discovery. The formulas were dead. The transactional nature of their faith had burned away, leaving behind a direct, unvarnished line to the Creator's heart. It was not a religious experience. It was a homecoming. They were no longer speaking into the void or toward a distant, silent statue. They were talking to a Father who was listening in the present, right here, in the dust of the hillside. Jesus did not look away. He held the gaze of each man in turn, letting the weight of the moment anchor them to the hillside. He saw the flicker of doubt in one, the lingering pride in another, and the overwhelming confusion that still clouded their features. He reached out and caught the eye of the man closest to him, his expression firm yet inviting. There would be no written scrolls to memorize tonight. There would be no shorthand to master for later use. He held their attention with the intensity of a man demanding everything, not just a portion. A disciple shifted, his instinct to recite the words back to prove his competence rising, but Jesus shook his head once, a subtle command to stop. He wanted no repetition. He wanted no theater. He wanted the total surrender of their own agendas. The silence grew heavy, pressing against them, forcing them to confront the radical simplicity of what had been spoken. He was asking for a life that started with the knees hitting the dirt and the ego being laid aside. His eyes searched them, steady and unblinking, until they could no longer look at their own feet. They looked back, their own defenses crumbling under the quiet pressure of his expectation. It was a call to live in the vulnerability of a child, day after day, in every breath and every step. The disciples finally turned their backs to the hillside, beginning the slow descent toward the village. The path beneath their feet felt the same, yet the world they were walking into had shifted on its axis. Each man moved with a measured, deliberate pace, the silence between them no longer filled with anxious chatter or debates over law. They carried the weight of the moment like a physical presence, a realization settling deep within their chests. They had been handed a map for life, not written on stone, but etched into the rhythm of their daily breath. A disciple paused near a cluster of rocks, looking back one last time at the spot where they had stood. He reached out, touching the rough surface of a stone, grounding himself in the reality of what had been spoken. They were no longer outsiders begging for access to a distant throne. They were children, walking toward their own homes with a name to call upon that turned every shadow into a sanctuary. The fear of the unknown that usually stalked their steps had been replaced by a quiet, persistent trust. They did not need to be perfect. They only needed to be present. They moved forward as one, the distance to the village floor shortening with every stride, their hearts beating in a new, unified cadence of belonging. The valley floor drew closer, but the destination felt secondary to the steady beat of the prayer now anchored in their minds. One disciple began to hum a low, wordless tune, and the others fell into step with him, their stride finding a natural, synchronized pace. The dusty track beneath their sandals seemed to vibrate with the quiet reality of the words they had just learned. It was not a ritual to be performed and then set aside. It was a constant, underlying conversation. As they navigated the uneven ground, the anxiety that usually flickered at the edges of their thoughts remained absent. When a gust of wind kicked up sand, they did not recoil. They simply adjusted their pace, the name of the Father lingering in their thoughts like a warm hearth. Every turn in the trail, every shift in the evening light, became an opportunity to acknowledge the presence that traveled with them. They reached the outskirts of the village as the first stars emerged, not as men burdened by the weight of religious performance, but as children walking in the light of an intimate, eternal bond. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was a lasting, rhythmic peace that promised to endure long after the sun had fully set.